Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Loren Richmond Jr. Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Paul Romig-Leavitt, and yes, I am not Loren Richmond Jr., but I am speaking to Loren Richmond Jr. here on the other side of the microphone, and he has not typically been in this seat during his own show. But we're going to talk to Loren Richmond, and if you don't know, I have got a little bit of an introduction for Loren, if you don't mind. Welcome to the podcast, first of all. Welcome to your own podcast,
Thanks.
Loren.
Yeah, it's a different position to be in.
Yes. Just for the record, you have to say it's good to be here. That is standard.
It is good to be here.
That's good. Good. Now that you're learning how to be more of a guest on a show, and that's totally great. Well, for those of you who've been listening for a while, you know who Loren is, but maybe you're tuning in for the first time. And let me tell you a little bit about Loren. Loren has his Master of Divinities from Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He grew up in, Maryland? Is that right?
Not quite. New York City and Colorado.
In New York City and Colorado. I was close. Maryland was close to this sort of. You grew up Independent Baptist, right? And your dad's a pastor. Yep. And you went to Bible college in Springfield, Missouri, and you got your Bachelor of Science in Youth Ministry and Bible, and then right out of that, you went right into youth ministry. Is that right?
Yep.
How about that for a dunk into ministry life?
Yeah, it was.
I bet. And then taking your first lead pastor role at a denominational church. Is that here in Colorado?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And had the task of a young lead pastor to turn around and revitalize this aging congregation, as there are many of those around, and you saw just this 50% rise in membership and in giving, and they were just so excited about that they were like, "We got to get you out of here." So no, I'm joking, but Loren has been the pastor for 3 years of Mission Gathering Christian Church in Thornton, Colorado, which is a progressive, inclusive Christian church committed to full LGBT plus inclusion, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that journey and Loren being a pastor of that church, but he's also studying to get his master's in business administration at Hope International University. He is just like nonstop. He doesn't know when to quit, but he's going into having an emphasis in nonprofit management, and he's also the host and producer of the Future Christian Podcast, in which he gets to talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders about their advice and their practical wisdom as the church is walking boldly into the future. I mean, he's had some pretty great guests. I'll just say some of my favorites are Jay Baker, and Brian McLaren just recently was really great. But if you go all the way back and listen to season 1, Diana Butler Bass, her conversation was really great. And then I loved conversations with Chuck DeGroat. Thomas J. Ord was just blowing my mind. It was really had some fantastic guests. So welcome, Loren. Is there anything I have missed in that setup? I know you're married, you have 2 young children. Maybe you can fill us in on a little bit of the rest of your story.
Well, the funnest and simplest way I like to say it is I'm a white suburban dad. I'm as white as suburban dad as you can get, almost. Like, I'm not currently wearing cargo shorts, but I was wearing them last night, and that's the epitome, I think, of white suburban dadness.
That's the uniform. If you move into a house, in suburban Colorado, and there isn't a pair of cargo shorts ready for you for your standard issue, then talk to your realtor, because that needs to happen. So, well, that's great. Well, Loren, tell me a little bit about your spiritual upbringing. What did it mean to you to be a Christian in the past, sort of as you were growing up?
Wow, this is bringing back some memories. So, my dad was a pastor in New York City, and in Flushing, Queens, I think it was. That's where, at least where I lived.
Okay.
And he was the pastor of a church there in Queens area. And we lived in a church parsonage, and my whole life was church. And when I was 5 years old, I remember having a conversation with my dad about getting saved. And for whatever reason, I remember one week he was asking me like, "Hey, Loren, why don't you come forward in church to get saved?" Because that was part of the culture back then.
Yeah.
And I just have this memory of one day walking in my dad's office and like, "Hey, Dad, I want to get saved today." And I was 5 years old, and that's what you did. I remember getting baptized, and then from there it was kind of all church all the time. And when I was in high school, church was a big part, and I sensed like a quote unquote call to ministry. And a big part of my formation as just a person was about when I was 8 or 9, for, to be honest, reasons I still don't understand to this day. As I said, we were living in the church parsonage, and my dad's church was struggling financially, and we ended up merging with another church. And that meant that we had to leave the parsonage. And obviously my dad didn't make a lot of money, and New York real estate being what it was, even back then, us finding a place to live wasn't within the scope of reason. So we moved out to my mom's parents here in Colorado. And, we were pretty low on the economic spectrum, so to speak. I mean, I remember at first we lived in their house, and then we lived in a small, like 600 foot, no, I think it was like 700 square foot, maybe 800 square foot, 2-bedroom house that was just tiny. And then we lived in public housing for a time. So it was really, it was an interesting experience growing up. But my dad had went to a Bible college, and I followed kind of his lead in some ways and went to Bible college straight out of high school, and was really committed to go into the ministry, so to speak. And I pursued, like Paul, you said, a degree in youth ministry and Bible, because that's what I wanted to do, was to minister to youth. And I got a job straight out of college, working as a youth director at a church. And I remember, it's like any first time ministry job where there's a lot of learnings and growth and stumbling and getting your feelings hurt that you come to realize later are just part of the job and part of ministry. But I remember like 13 months in, the pastor came to me, and the church was poorly managed, to be honest. It was just like many churches, poorly managed. And I remember they came to me and said, like, the pastor came to me and said, "Hey, Loren, what would you think if, we need to cut your salary by 2/3. And I was obviously a bit taken aback by that.
I like that it's posed as a question. What do you think? What do you think if we cut your salary 2/3?
Yeah, so I was obviously being young in ministry, and having come out of the quote unquote honeymoon period of ministry, so to speak. I just took that as like, I guess it's time to leave. In hindsight, probably would have been better to me just say that's bullshit, and let's figure something else out. But we left. I was married. Cree and I were married. Got married really young, and moved back to Colorado, and then months later moved back to Springfield, Missouri, so she could finish her degree. And in that process, I I entered state school to try to do a religious studies graduate degree, and somehow found myself into a deconstruction. And questioned everything, and eventually met a Disciples of Christ pastor named Phil Snyder, and he introduced me to a book by Marcus Borg called Heart of Christianity, which is probably, I say, would have saved my faith, I think, in many ways. And eventually led me, I realized, like, hey, graduate school is not for me, but I still want to pursue this. So eventually found my way to seminary, and to eventually to ordained ministry, which has been, as any pastor will say, full of blessings and cursings, I guess we might say.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, you've articulated a kind of path that at least I can relate to a lot, because that was my first job out of college. I went to college for worship ministry, but I ended up getting a job in youth ministry in the first my first position in a full-time role in a church, and that was just, it seems like the right atmosphere to have some sort of deconstruction, because it's eventually like inevitable in youth ministry, I suppose, because just because of how so many churches are structured for that youth person to be so transitional.
Yeah.
And just kind of turned out and all that kind of stuff. How would you say your Christianity, what's the contrast between then and now? What's a real, how do you know you're different in terms of your Christianity now?
The shortest answer I can give is like, where 20 years ago I was all about knowing all the answers. Now I just, I don't say I don't care, but it's not important to me. Like, I'm less concerned. Like, you ask me today how I feel about a theological doctrine, I might answer one way. If you ask me tomorrow, I might answer completely different. And it's not that I don't think those are important or that they have impact. It's just that I don't think that's what really matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? It's like the last time somebody had asked me about whether I believed in a literal interpretation of Genesis or not, or what if science and Christianity can coexist, and that those sort of questions now just make me so exhausted, because I feel like I have to go back in time to figure out, like, okay, how do I have this conversation that the very premise of the conversation is something I don't give any time to, don't want to have anything to do with. So, but you've continued to have, in the midst of these the deconstruction, the reconstruction, the ongoing ministry work, are there any spiritual practices that you've discovered that have been really life-giving to you?
I mean, I think it was for a long time running. I've had a back injury that I haven't been able to do that, and so I've gotten into bike riding a lot. I'd also say journaling. I'm nearing the end of a journal that I started almost 15 years ago. So it's not an everyday occurrence. It's once or twice a week. And then I'm not very good at it, but I'm trying to incorporate prayer regularly. Sounds terrible.
Yeah. I'm the first person who is just kind of like, I'm terrible at prayer, but I feel like I want to get better at prayer. And it seems like that would have been a really strange thing for me to say when I was a younger Christian.
Yeah.
Because I thought, oh, prayer is the easiest thing in the world. What is it? It's just talking to God. It's just like and then as I matured, I think I matured and got better, I realized actually prayer is really difficult because it's more than just talking, right?
Yeah.
It's actually, prayer is primarily listening. And I had experiences with people taking me on contemplative retreats and showing me some sort of contemplative practices where I realized, oh my gosh, how difficult it is, because I have to be faced with silence. I have to be faced with myself, with the chatter of my ego in prayer. And I think that that's why a lot of people kind of avoid prayer and just, at least Christians do, avoid prayer and substitute it with saying prayers.
Hmm.
I could just say a prayer here in
Yeah.
a small group, or say a prayer at church or whatever. And so, yeah. And that's the thing about the spiritual practices that I think what's interesting about the ones that you mentioned is they all kind of they require some level of focus and a little suffering. They're hard.
Hmm.
Biking, not always easy,
Yeah.
right? Biking is hard because you got hills,
Yeah,
or you got to
yesterday,
figure
trust
those
me,
things out,
I was sweating pretty good.
right? Yeah, because I mean, it's the same. Like running is part of my spiritual practice,
Yeah.
and I've never gotten to a place where it's like every morning I go, "Oh, I can't wait to go running." No, it's still kind of difficult, and that I think makes it an effective spiritual practice. Okay, so Loren, one of the things we're gonna just do is I'm gonna ask you some of these questions that are related to kind of the season that you're in right now,
Mm-hmm.
because you're actually experiencing something that, at least from the research that I've seen from Gallup and from placement industries like Slingshot and stuff, would say about 30 to 40 million people, who tend to be like, white, educated, usually male, are going through this season that in their deconstruction where their faith has just sort of gotten to this place where they kind of lose church into some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And both professionally, a lot of them professionally, and they're sort of out. They're sort of and I wanted to ask you if that's something you would like to talk about during this time.
Sure.
Yeah, tell me what's the current landscape of your life right now.
Well, the current thing that I'm most recently working through, I guess, is I think you talked about it in the introduction, but the church that I started a little over 3 years ago, Mission Gathering Christian Church in Thornton, it's coming to a close. And, like any new church, nothing's guaranteed in life, yet I can't imagine anyone who starts a ministry like this, while we probably all know that the odds are stacked against us, it's certainly not, it's not what you want. It's not what you worked hard for. And I think that's, it's hit me. I guess I'd say I didn't realize how hard it would hit me, just the grieving process of seeing this come to a close.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this moment right now and where people are maybe listening to you is this is like ground zero. Often, some pastor will come on a podcast about a year or 2 years after a church is closed, and they'll talk about the season of wilderness, the liminal space that they experienced, right? But that's not where you are. That you're right at the beginning, and there's so much, I would imagine, for you, for the people around you, to try and rush to create some narrative that gives this meaning or hope. Like I think we are often addicted to hope, but not in a good way.
Yeah.
We're addicted to hope in the ways in which we can cover over some of the pain, some of the grieving, in order to just not feel uncomfortable and go like, yeah, this really sucks. And this was not by design. This is not a good thing. Like this is a bad thing, and it's okay to say that and sort of stay in that. What have you been noticing about yourself right now in the season? Because maybe even kind of let us know where you are in sort of the timeline of events.
Yeah.
From when you started to sense this thing was and we were coding this in the sort of after the first year of a global pandemic.
Yeah.
And when things started to look like, oh, I don't know if this is going to make it, and then where you are now.
I mean, I think by some stretch, like in the broadest context, like the Denver area is a super hard market, so to speak, context to start a church. Like
Yeah.
evangelicals come here all the time and die, don't make it. Starting a progressive LGBTQ plus affirming church
Right.
is another matter. So I think,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I was under any illusions that this thing was guaranteed to work. And I know, but there was, I can remember like a few times back, like when a Sunday morning went well and be like, holy shit, this is going to work, like, man, this is going to make it. And then, the pandemic came around and I looked at it as like, okay, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity. Trying to think that opportunity language. And it, as the pandemic wore on and it wore on and it wore on and it wore on, I kept trying to pivot and pivot and pivot. And I think a lot of what the common narrative around entrepreneurship and new things is that, well, if you're just creative enough and hardworking enough and energetic enough, like things will work out. And I don't mean to discount energy and creativity and hard work, but there's some things that it's just too much. And I don't,
Right.
and I don't want to say it was all the pandemic, because I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But I know I was kind of wrestling with like, how is this going to work? And thinking about bivocationality, about how much cost am I willing to really bear to myself and my family as this thing goes on. And so about a little over a month ago, some of my superiors, so to speak, came to me and said, Loren, I think it's time. And I didn't like hearing it, to be honest, and I still don't like hearing it, but I think, I told this person, I don't think you're wrong. So as we stand today, like literally today, we're recording this, the last Sunday or last weekend service is a couple weeks away, and I don't feel any better about it, to be honest, than I did a month ago.
Yeah.
Like, just to be real, like it still hurts the same.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, like, I'm not sure you ask about how it's hit my body. I'm not sure I've noticed how it's hit my body yet, to be honest.
Yeah.
I know this, like,
Well, one thing. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I have this pain in my neck that I feel like is stress related.
Well, it seems like I've heard a lot of people recently saying like the body knows first,
Yeah.
and how interconnected our bodies and our emotions are, that we'll often feel some of the trauma in our bodies before we even know that it's, oh, that's anger, that's sadness, or whatever. I've started to notice a little bit of those things. One thing that came up it was actually in a recent podcast of Future Christian. You were talking with, I don't remember her name. It was about burnout. What was her name?
Yeah, Bethany Dearborn Heiser.
There we go. And really about this idea of kind of toxic productivity. I don't know if she even used that, but that is a defense mechanism toward grief. If we can like ramp up our productivity. Have you felt that temptation to kind of like, okay, no loss is going to get me down. Nothing is going to like, did you kind of have that narrative like, I'm going to come back stronger?
Well, I think that was kind of like my attitude, like during the pandemic, at least during the latter half. Like, hey, I'm just gonna work harder, and we're gonna get out of this. Like, it's just like if I can just be creative enough and innovative enough, like that, this is gonna work out. Kind of like just not recognizing the inevitable, and to some extent, I'm slowly learning. Like yesterday, as I joked about in that podcast, and our listeners will have to go back and listen to that. Like I joked about how I always kind of like snidely think about folks who take a day off to go like on a prayer hike or something. So yesterday I'm just like, F that. Like I'm going to go for a bike ride. So I went to North Table Mountain, which is a nice nature trail area around here, and did a mountain bike and sweated my butt off because it was a hard ride. But it was like, or else I'm just going to sit around and come up with things to do that I don't really need to do.
Yeah. That's, I think, one of the things that I think could be so important for anybody listening, because we all go through change. And change is, depending, it's kind of on a spectrum. It could be very dramatic, and I would say on the scale of stress, losing jobs, and especially something like starting a church that you've been solely responsible for, and seeing that end is huge. It's a trauma. It's something that, and being sort of normalizing your experience can be really helpful. And she was like, okay, this is actually okay that I'm acting like this, that I'm really feeling these things. These are normal. When we just try in our society, we just kind of like, nope, it's any sort of weakness is just got to get pushed down or set aside because it doesn't belong. And you were going to say something about that? Sorry, I was talking.
Well, I was just going to say, like, that's one thing that I have been trying to be really intentional about, is just honoring my grief. Like you said, there's always this kind of push to just tough it out and get through. And, I don't like it, to be frank. I don't like this feeling. But again, kind of what you said, like, one of a teacher and mentor that I like to follow says that all change is loss, and loss is like a death, and it needs to be grieved.
Yeah. And
by just rushing through and pushing through and not honoring those feelings, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Yeah. And the things and the people that we love a disservice.
Yeah.
There's something, and I saw this behind you. I can see we're on screens, and this is just an audio-only podcast, but it came up in one of our virtual meetings through the pandemic, and I noticed that there's a little stuffed Eeyore on your bookshelf back behind you.
A couple, actually.
And I can't remember. A couple, yeah. All right. So, and I think I can't remember who asked about that, but can you tell a little bit about why there's Eeyore on your shelf? Because I do think that's really important to this conversation.
Yeah, this is a fun story, actually, because when I was in Bible college, there was this guy who's kind of just a douche, to be honest. He's this big guy. He has a big, huge, like 6'4", probably 250, 300 pounds. So he could just kind of bully anybody, and he took advantage of that, even in Bible college. That's another conversation. But anyway,
yeah.
For some reason, whenever I walked by, he'd be like, "Oh, there's Eeyore," and he's like, "One gray rain cloud." And I remember, like, this was even in my first church job at that Baptist church when I was youth pastor. I think they're the first ones who gave me one of these first Eeyores, and kind of since then, I've just kind of embraced like this kind of Eeyore persona. And certainly the moniker has fit in many ways, thinking just about my own mental health, kind of the way that my energy, like when I come to a conversation or it can be kind of ho-hum, and then my energy will increase. So rather than kind of shy away from it, I've just tried to embrace, like, this is who I am, and not be afraid of that.
Yeah. I think that's so powerful of a story in so many levels for me when I heard that, because I think that guy, I'm so interested in when people are named, when people get named things, especially because I think I find this contrast in Jesus that he approaches people who have been given labels and he gives them names.
Yeah.
That's huge, right? But the fact is, this guy wanted to label you
Yeah.
as this like ho hum.
No
It was meant to
fun.
be as no fun. And look, if you were just positive and happy and just like you could be successful or you could be like you're bringing everybody down. Like we used even terms like the Debbie Downer character,
Yeah.
that was popular on SNL and stuff like
Yeah.
that. We throw those around and I will say that there's something, and Brene Brown says this really well. She goes like vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability.
Yeah.
So there is something to be said about somebody who doesn't know how to, um, doesn't have the boundaries to, I don't know, understand the appropriateness of when to bring in all of their grief, all of their sadness and anger, and if it's on a maxed out to 11 in every conversation,
Right.
that's not boundaries. But somebody who is just like comfortable with being sad, is a definite need and a minister to our community, to our world. And I think about how Eeyore actually operates within the sort of circle of friends in Winnie the Pooh, and why actually he's like, for my children, they love Eeyore, and we've always loved Eeyore, because I think he gives children the permission to be sad. And I've loved children's writers like Maurice Sendak and Roald Dahl, who allow kids to have darker emotions,
Yeah.
to feel anger, to not clean it up, to put some scary things in there. And what does it do? It allows them to actually enjoy the brighter emotions, the happier emotions as well. It embraces the full spectrum of being a human. And so the fact that you actually took that on and said, no, I believe that this is something, you're like, I'm embracing my weakness. And that is, at least in the Jesus language, that's where strength comes from. Strength comes from weakness, not from strength.
Yeah.
So, and I do think that's important in a season like this, and for a lot of people who go through similar things like you're going through, that they experience this kind of, they tap into their inner Eeyore. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a time and place, there can, if I was all Eeyore all the time, I think that would be a problem. But conversely, you and I know that so often Christianity is just expected this to be super peppy, positive, God is great all the time, hallelujah. And it just, come on, it's not the biblical witness. Like, that's not what we see.
Yeah. Who is it? I'm going to get her name wrong. Barbara Taylor Brown.
Yeah.
Barbara Brown Taylor.
I think you had the first time.
Barbara Brown Taylor. Barbara Taylor Brown. I can't do it.
Barbara Taylor Brown, if
Barbara
you're
Taylor
listening,
Brown.
I do want you on the podcast, so I'm sorry we're butchering your name.
I just finished her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, and it is a life changer. So important. But she talks about full solar churches. Churches that are just like, they don't acknowledge the dark at all.
Yeah.
They just, and how that just, it lies about the gospel, lies about God, and that's something that really bothers me.
Yeah.
What is that like for you now? I want to talk a little bit this idea when it comes to closing a church and experiencing things that are uncomfortable, like grief, and walking people through that. People are still looking to you to be a guide through this transition. What does it look like to be, I'm going to use the word because I know you're a family systems guy,
Yeah.
to be self-differentiated in this process?
Boy, it's been hard. It's been hard. I think in some ways I've had to advocate for myself and just say, like, hey, this is the best. I literally got nothing else to give you. Like, sometimes I've just had to say, like, your pep talk isn't what I need right now. I'm giving you the best I got. There's been times I've tried to advocate for my congregation in ways that's blown up in my face, and that's been hard. I don't think, to use the word, being self-differentiated, it's not easy, for sure. It's not easy. But but I'd like to think anyway that it's the best, healthiest approach. Especially
Do you
it's
think
gonna
you would
honor
probably
me.
not? Right, right. I can see a couple of spots, actually watching the whole life of Mission Gathering, really,
Yeah,
from the first Sunday until the last. A couple of places where you made some hard decisions that, in the moment, would have pleased somebody, would
yeah.
have pleased powerful people, um, and but would have been maybe off the mission. And do you think, like, if I just would have said yes to those things, would I be in the same situation
Every
now, or
day.
would I have more people? You do.
I mean, I wouldn't say every day, but the thought crosses my mind a lot, and you wonder, like, if you had said yes to that person and caved on this, like, would the story be different? And I think what I have to go back to, and folks might disagree with me on this, and that's fine. Speaking of being self-differentiate, I guess. But
Yeah.
I'm a believer that God had given me a call and a vision. And I know this isn't super popular these days. What seems to be the approach these days is just kind of this universal consensus of everyone's opinion matters, or everyone's opinion is equally valid. And I don't want to discount people's voices, or their stories, or their experiences, or what they can bring to the table. But I know we talked about this as a staff, kind of this internal value of everyone has a voice, but not everyone has a vote. And for me, at least, I just think, like, different people have different gifts, different callings, different skill sets that I would say are given by God, and by equating everyone's opinion or voice or vote to be the same, it's diminishing and discounting what I believe is to be God's gifting, unique gifting to each person.
Right. Right.
So it's hard. I wrestle a lot with it. Like, would things be different? Maybe. Would I be being true to what I believe that God had called me to? I'm not sure. And
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with that. I guess that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with that.
That's,
but I'll say for
that's
me,
great. I mean, yeah.
I guess I'd just say for me, like, when push comes to shove, I try to lean back on what I believe that God has called me to, and let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, we can talk forever on that.
Yeah.
But I think I probably just last little thing. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because it came up in a conversation yesterday. There's this company base camp that does a lot of groups meetings and all this stuff. A big number of employees get together and they're like, "Hey, we need to change kind of the vision and mission of the company to really incorporate social justice more." And I was like, that's really cool. Yes, they're right. Yes, it's important. But it's complicated, because then the CEO was like, no, actually, our mission is to deliver the best product for our customers, not to get involved. Those are things we care about. Those are things we believe in. But as a company, we have to be really focused. And they said, no, we've got to change things. And they let go a third of their staff.
Wow.
Like, in one day. And it's a big company.
Wow.
Like, and there's something about that says, that's, to me, what it looks to go like, I cannot compromise on the vision. I can't compromise on the mission. Those are the things. And now we can have conversations about whether that is the right mission, whether it's the vision. That's fine.
Yeah.
But that's a long process, and it usually doesn't happen within, like, almost never happens in ultimatums, for sure.
Yeah.
When somebody says, like, no, we've got to do this now, because there is this anxiety culturally right now that says we got to behave in these ways. And it's tricky, because I agree with a lot of those values, but it's also, there's no way to win. And the differentiated leader is often lonely and often alone in those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, we're going to close up with a few questions, but before that, we're going to take a quick break and we'll come back for our closing questions. Great. So thanks for listening. We've got a few questions, closing questions, Loren. You get to ask these every time. I'm super curious about your answers. First is, if you were Pope for a day, what would you do?
This is totally off the top of my head, but I think I want to travel the world. So being the Pope or some similar level of authority would provide me, I imagine, a considerable level of resources. So I think traveling the world would be pretty cool. Just even if it was literally 24 hours, just I don't know. This is a good question. If you were going against time, traveling, I don't know. Some could totally, maybe my geography kind of thinking is wrong, but if you were going backwards, so to speak, against days, could you make it around the world? I wonder in 24 hours even stopping.
That's a good question. I don't know. I just finished watching that movie Tenet that talks about entropy and time travel.
Oh, don't spoil it for me.
Oh, that's basically the premise. You'll have to watch it. I'm going to have to watch it 2 or 3 times to just understand it. But yeah, that's kind of in there. But where would you go first? What's the first place in the world where you go?
I mean, I feel like Jerusalem would have to be one.
Okay.
I guess I'm Pope, so I don't need to go to Rome because I'm already there.
Right, that's your house.
Yeah, it's my house. And then, London, and then beyond that, probably want to go to Asia.
Cool.
I feel like I need to stop off in Antarctica because, not
You're
a lot
Pope.
of people get to Antarctica.
You got to go to the coldest place.
Right.
When was the last time the Pope went to Antarctica?
Right.
I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
Seriously.
I mean, I believe that God is redeeming the entire world through Jesus.
That's right.
So
let's get some St. Francis up in here. Come on now. We're going to go bless some penguins.
Yeah.
So along those lines, is there a theological or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
I mean, I think the one that comes to mind is I mentioned Marcus Borg. He's deceased now, and I really credit his book for kind of saving my faith. I got to see him once at an event several years back, but I think he'd be one I'd be interested in talking with, just because maybe if it's just kind of like, thank you for doing that.
Right. That's so great. Okay, I'd like to ask you these questions about our current time and place. What do you think history will remember about the church, about Christianity from this time and season in our life?
I think the word you've used is anxiety, and that's what I think. We're in just such a time of transition, and there's so much anxiety around what's next. How do we behave? How do we act? So much is changing, and there's so much anxiety around that, and so much of our decisions aren't well thought out or principled. They're just kind of anxious reactions. And there's certainly a lot more that could be discussed there, but that's something that comes to mind for me.
Yeah. Well, then, if we were to turn that over and ask about the hopes, what is your hope for the future of Christianity in the world?
I think for me, and I kind of mentioned this at the top, I'm less of a person who, 20 years ago, I would be all about my list of core doctrines and why I believe, my list of faith, and my phone is ringing right now. I think I'd say, for me, it's, to use the word, orthopraxy is much more important to me than orthodoxy. And I think following the way of Jesus is something that I'm concerned about more. And I know there's a lot there as far as, who's the historical Jesus, and, what historical traditions do we get that are not really Jesus but are the church. And I think if we're trying, that's a good start.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think just that simplicity and that picture of simplicity is great. Well, Loren, I suppose people can find out more about you here in this podcast, The Future Christian, you're also going to be on the Chasing Sunday podcast with, yours truly, as we're talking here. But is there anywhere else that we can find you and people looking to interact with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm online. I just, on Twitter last night, Paul was recording this. I just changed my name to Failed Church Planner on Twitter.
I love it.
We talked about this offline, doing that.
Yeah.
I have a little media podcast production company called Resonate Media Pro. So resonatemediapro.com. And I just say, like, if you're someone, this is my sickness, to be honest. I love church. I love church. If you're someone who wants to talk about church, if you're passionate about creative, innovative ways to grow and lead church, like, I want to talk to you. And I just love talking about this stuff. I'll close with a story. Like, I went to this retreat once amongst other pastors, and one of the things we had to do for the day was a 24-hour period of silence. And I was so mad. I'm like, this is stupid. I'm amongst young, energetic pastors and leaders, and I have to be quiet for a day.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, Loren, it was great talking with you. Thanks for being on your own podcast, for being on the Chasing Sunday podcast. And I want to leave with you this benediction, Loren, as you enter this next season, that rest settles into your body and into your mind, and that you experience the full depth of God's grace and love for you, and that in the silence you hear the song of who you are. And be blessed. Thank you, and thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Torn Curtain Arts in partnership with Resonate Media. To learn more about Loren or the podcast, visit futurechristian.com. If you've enjoyed the show and you think it would be valuable for others to hear, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. That really helps more people find us. Thanks again, and go in peace.